and KXVS Radio. I will discuss relevant issues affecting animals and pet owners today, how to avoid common problems, and how to extend the quality of life for your cherished companions. As a community advocate, I will also discuss important social issues that affect our city. I plan to showcase organizations and heroes who are doing amazing things to help others. Remember to tune in every Tuesday morning at 10, starting soon.
This is Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla with Delta Flows, a radio show by the Voice of Stockton and Restore the Delta. This is the weekly radio show where we discuss everything Delta related: the environment, water management, water quality, farming, history and culture, public events, recreation, Delta food, and the arts. Tune into Delta Flows on KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at KXVS Radio.
KXVS 92.1 coming soon. KXVS.
This is Delta Flows on KXVS, the Voice of Stockton, with your host, Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla.
Thank you, Governor Don. Welcome to Delta Flows, the show that is everything about the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. On today's show, we'll be discussing the status of the Delta Tunnels project, named, or rather misnamed by the state as California Water Fix. Joining me in the studio is Tom Keeling, attorney with the Freeman firm, representing San Joaquin County in the California Water Fix hearings and at the State Water Resources Control Board, and Jonas Mintins, water program manager at the Planning and Conservation League. Jonas is also a former deputy director with the California Department of Water Resources. Good morning, Tom and Jonas.
Morning. Good morning, Barbara.
Thank you for being here. And joining us on the phone is Osha Miserve. Osha is an environmental and water attorney with Friends of the Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge and local agencies of the North Delta. Good morning, Osha.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us. I'd like to start our conversation today with you first, Jonas. Can you describe for our listeners where we are at in the permitting process for the Delta Tunnels?
This is a very large project, one of the largest ever conceived in the state of California, or actually almost in the country. As such, it requires multiple permits. Let me describe two of the processes and some of the problems that have been encountered. The first is with the environmental impact report. This is where the proponents, in this case Governor Brown's Department of Water Resources and various water districts, identify what they believe the project would be. They should identify how the project would be operated and what its impacts would be. The second process is with the State Water Resources Control Board. Because this is a water project that would divert supplies from the state's waters, they are required to achieve a permit. That is a very intensive process. It's already taken 1 year. The first year was to identify whether any other parties would be harmed, other water users, when this project diverts so much water. The second process, which is underway next year, is to identify whether there would be any environmental impacts. Both of these processes have suffered from the same flaw, however. That's that the proponents, Governor Brown's department, and other water districts, most notably the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, sometimes just called MET, they have been unable or unwilling to identify how the project would operate. And why is that important? Well, a key element of how it would be operated is, it sounds simple, but how much water these giant tunnels would divert and when they would divert them. They have been, again, unable or unwilling to state that. Now, imagine if you are one of the other water users in the state, all the way from Reading down to Bakersfield, that rely on these same sources of water. And the state won't tell you how much water this project is going to suck out. Also, imagine if you're an environmental group. How will the fisheries be affected when they won't tell you how much will be diverted? Lastly, important for the listeners today, what are the impacts within the delta itself? How will these diversions affect the water quality? And how can that be assessed? As a result, there are already 30 lawsuits with 82 different plaintiffs. These are public agencies, nonprofit groups, landowners, water districts, reclamation districts, utilities, environmentalists, and farmers, all saying, hey, we don't have enough information.
That's fascinating, and I think that's a really nice description of what's happening. Particularly this week, the proponents for Cal Water Fix, DWR, really being led by Metropolitan Water District, held an industry day. And we've heard some reports about what came out of that industry day. Osha, can you tell us what you've heard and what was reported to you about the findings from the industry day event today, or this week?
Yes, what we heard at industry day was that the governor's tunnel proposal is trying to proceed as if nothing is wrong. As we just heard from Jonas, there's quite a bit wrong with the proposal, and there's a lot of pending challenges and on a lot of permits that haven't been issued yet. It appears that at industry day, the DWR and the proponents of the tunnels, in particular the water contractors, are saying they are going to proceed with issuing requests for proposals and qualifications for at least perhaps up to $1 billion of work toward the starting to do eminent domain of all the properties that are needed, as well as having the managing the engineering process, which they admit they only have 5% design. And they're saying it's not a public works project, which is odd, and so it leads to the question of who's paying for what they're talking about moving forward on right now, and that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of, because we don't understand how the state can move forward with trying to actually implement the project when so many permits haven't even been issued. For instance, the federal permit from the Bureau of Reclamation in order to clear the National Environmental Policy Act review, Water Board, which is mentioned, and many, many others. So why would the state and the contractors be dumping money into this, and what's the vehicle by which they're doing that? So that all sort of came to fruition at the industry day, where they're basically trying to say nothing's wrong, and apparently flashed a screen of the pending approvals up, which is a very long list, for only a couple seconds, so that folks at the meeting couldn't really get the sense that this project is nowhere near finalized.
That's very interesting, and that ties into some of the litigation that's happening. Tom, you're working on several cases, and you've worked historically on litigation the last 5 years on behalf of Delta interests. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening right now with the CEQA litigation, and what are some of the most important claims in the case?
Well, the CEQA litigation, in fact, Osha and I are co-counsel in that, challenge the validity of the environmental impact report on various grounds, which are fairly technical for this context, but the adequacy of the report itself, and we're not the only ones, we're one of maybe 17 or 18 actions directly challenging it. We're also challenging the findings and determinations underlying the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's issuance of the incidental take permit, and we're doing that in the same lawsuit.
Okay. What are some of the key important findings you think that our listeners should know about? What are some of the really, I guess, flaws you see in the environmental impact report?
The flaws in the environmental impact report are largely the same as Jonas referred to earlier. It's not what we know in many instances, it's what we don't know. It's the indeterminate. For example, critical junctures in the analysis, the Department of Water Resources has relied upon something called adaptive management, which is technical speak for trust us, we'll take care of it later, you don't need to know now. So that's part of it. Then there are inadequate baseline requirements, inadequate or insufficient or non-science-based or assumptions and determinations of a technical nature, and a failure to use best available science, again, at critical junctures in the analysis.
Okay.
And OSHA might be able to elaborate on that.
Osha, do you have more you want to add on to that subject about what some of the findings that were in the environmental impact report that really needed challenging?
Well, I mean, I think Jonas mentioned at the beginning just how large this project is, and I think it's the largest project I've ever worked on or opposed, and I hope it is in my whole career, honestly, because it's just so, I mean, it is a big challenge that the state and the proponents of this project would have to try to describe what all the environmental impacts of, tunneling 35 miles and generating, I think, 34 million cubic yards of muck, and all the devastation of the environment that would come with it. But that's really what they've said they would do is in the environmental impact report is that they're required, if they're doing a project level document, which they've claimed they've done, to actually describe all those impacts in detail and then mitigate to the extent feasible. And what the claims that we've brought and the other 17 plaintiff groups really dig into all these different impacts and whether they've been adequately disclosed, which they have not. Most of them have been swept under the rug, and the document tries to say that everything's either been resolved or going to be resolved by some kind of future agreements or discussions, for instance, on water supply issues for local communities like Stockton and other water users. There's grave concerns about additional contaminants because of the fresh water being taken out at the top of the delta under this project, and treatment costs for cities of Stockton and other cities along the delta that rely on this source of water, and they're being told, oh yeah, we will mitigate later, we'll figure out a way to make sure you guys have safe water supplies. Meanwhile, the water exporters would get out of this project the ability to reduce their own treatment costs. So all that's supposed to be reflected in the environmental documents, and that's what we're saying it has not been. Another huge issue in the environmental documents is whether it's disclosed the grave impacts to the groundwater supplies in the area because of the recharge that would be lost if that much water is taken out of the river up near Sacramento. That's critical to Sacramento and San Joaquin groundwater supplies, that the river continue to do that as it flows naturally south toward the bay. So those are some of the key issues that are going to be litigated in CEQA. And then I would just add with the endangered species, our lawsuit brought on behalf of local agencies within the Delta area, as well as a couple of others brought by environmental groups, challenges whether Department of Fish and Wildlife has fully disclosed and fully mitigated impacts on endangered species, and some that we at Friends of Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge and other groups have focused on is there are several fully protected species within the Delta, like the greater sandhill crane and the kite that local people may have appreciated, for instance, at the Sandhill Crane Festival in Lodi, and various, and just throughout the Delta, since it's winter time, it's a great time to see these magnificent birds, and they're fully protected. And this project, because of all the power lines in particular that would be required to bring in power to these massive tunnel boring machines, as well as to operate the project if it was built going forward permanently, these huge birds would be struck on the power lines and die. And so that's a very important issue that we're bringing forward to show that Fish and Game and Department of Water Resources have not complied with this important state law to protect these kinds of species.
Let me add this. Among other things, the entire project, the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report, is premature. The state concedes that its engineering on the project itself, the most massive project in California water infrastructure history, into which they've already spent over $250 million, is roughly 10% designed. Well, that's another 90% to go. On top of that, they've conceded that in many areas of the Delta, which contains very complex and sensitive soil types, depending on the depth and the area of the Delta, they haven't done the preliminary investigations to get in and find out what it is they're going to be trying to tunnel through. So, in one sense, they've just rushed this way fast. That's why it's premature.
And it is premature, despite the fact that they've worked on the project, 11 years. They didn't do the right kind of work and get the right kind of work done, the right kind of analysis for the magnitude of the environmental impacts. And it's not just the magnitude of the environmental impacts from the project, but it's also the magnitude of the cost. So, Jonas, when we talk about, the viability of the tunnels, the state audit made it clear that the project really hasn't done a good deal of the financial planning. And it's interesting because when you compare that to the industry day they held where they're trying to sell to businesses to participate in construction, it's like we have two planes of reality kind of not intersecting about what's really happening with the project. Where do you think the tunnels really stand in terms of viability?
Well, as Tom and Osha mentioned, there are a lot of procedural issues and a lot of litigation that are appropriate to question the viability of the project from an environmental and a water quality perspective. But the biggest problem they have is financial. And it's like this. After 11 years, and they've spent $280 million trying to identify and promote a project, they don't have one that can answer the most basic questions. And for those who would pay for the project, the basic question is, it's very simple, how much water would I get? So these water districts, and we're talking about the Westlands Water District, that's a federal district. The federal water users would receive about half the water from the project. There's the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. That's on the state side. They would get about a quarter of the water, and there's some others. And they reasonably ask the question, all right, if we put up, and the total here is estimated right now as $17 billion, how much water do we get? And the state of California has only been able to say, we don't know. We can't guarantee it. Now, a couple of things about that. The first is the $17 billion figure. As Tom Keeling just mentioned, that's when a project is only less than 10% designed. Any of you who've ever done maybe a bathroom remodeling project, kitchen in your home, you kind of get the first estimate, and then it sort of increases and increases. And we've seen this with the state of California already. We've seen it with the Bay Bridge, where the costs more than quadrupled. This is not unusual in large projects.
Right.
So these water districts are saying, well, for $17 billion at least, what do I get? Well, right now their answer has been, remember the Westlands Water District, those are the federal ones, would pay about half. They voted 7-1 not to participate. They dropped out.
That's right.
The Kern County Water Agency, which would be another large share, said, well, we'll only put up about half. Another district in the Bay Area, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, said, we don't think two work. Why don't you go back and think about just one tunnel that would be cheaper? So that's the biggest problem they have right now, and it's one that frankly just doesn't seem to have an answer.
No, it really doesn't. And so these two planes of reality, that's what's really happening in terms of financial commitments. Yet we have the Department of Water Resources moving forward with a validation action. which is really technical speak for our listeners. So, Tom, can you explain what is their validation suit? What does it mean to respond to it? What is that process really about?
I will do that, but I want to follow up on something Jonas said about the water. We've gone, as you said, 11 years, and people forget that when this first started, the mantra from the state was, we're not talking about exporting more water out of the Delta.
That's right.
Just more reliable supplies.
Right.
Now, later, that fig leaf dropped off a little bit during the water fix hearings when their witnesses conceded, well, we could conceivably, yes, we could export more water. So if I were somebody in line to get more water out of this project, I would look at the history of the representations made, and I would be very uneasy, just to add on to what Jonas said.
Sure.
And not only can they not tell you how much water they're going to get, they can't tell you reliably how much it's going to cost. The state also cannot give you any assurances about what regulatory regime those exports, this project would be operating under, including the flow criteria. But to go to your question, Barbara, on the validation action, validation actions are arcane and specialized. Most lawyers look at you and ask, what on earth is that? So I will give a very general overview.
Okay.
Imagine you are a public entity, an agency, a water district, for example, and you have a project. Public projects tend to be large and very complicated. Many contractors, the issuance of bonds, well, bonds have to have somebody who will buy them.
Right.
Buyers, investors, bond houses, they don't buy unless they get certain assurances, obviously,
right.
Which help determine the interest rates and so on. Other interested parties, water contractors, for example, who might be getting water, will want to know that the financing is secure. You want these assurances ahead of time. You don't want to find out in a lawsuit after you've put your money on the table that this whole thing is an unlawful boondoggle. So California law provides a statute that allows issuers of these kinds of revenue bonds and other financing mechanisms to go into court to lay out their case, to say these are our resolutions authorizing this financing, in this case the bonds, and we have authority under the law to issue these bonds, and we want your imprimatur, court, we want your approval so that we can take assurances out to the bond market, out to others, out to the public and other entities, public entities, that this is we're golden.
Right.
Well, DWR's validation action seeks to create binding obligations in revenue bonds to finance the capital costs of this misnamed water fix. DWR specifically seeks to validate revenue bonds that have been authorized in the amount of $11 billion, with a B, dollars in capital costs, and to approve the resolutions, and to pledge the revenues, because the only way these bonds are going to get paid back, the bondholders, is through the revenues generated by the operations of the project, which incidentally, if they started it next year, wouldn't begin to flow under the best scenario until the mid-2030s, or public taxpayer backstop. That's the second basis. In this case, however, DWR admits in its validation complaint that it doesn't have the other legal requirements. OSHA was talking about the permits, and indeed it doesn't have the basic permit from the Water Board. It doesn't have the Army Corps permits. It doesn't have federal environmental impact statement approval. So DWR's had to say to the state, we want you to approve these bonds, but really we can't give you any assurances that the project for which we're seeking this $11 billion financing is or will ever be lawful. They've been very upfront about that.
Right.
Which creates a problem. If you're looking to a judgment of validation as an assurance, if you're a third party looking for that, and you get an assurance that is devoid of any assurance about the lawfulness of the project, what kind of an assurance is that?
And what really complicates matters, people very often in the Delta and in Northern California have an anger that Southern California wants our water, they want to fill up their pools. But the truth is, for ratepayers down there, which is so problematic about this, is that they're being told you won't have to pay for any water you don't get from the project. You will only have to pay for water you take from the project. But, based on what is entailed in a validation action and what bond grantors need, they need guarantees for fixed payments. You just don't get to pay back a bond based on how much water you take or sell.
That's correct. And to put that in perspective, if they get what they want, they'll have 70 years of bond financing debt in the billions of dollars, which will subject ratepayers and property taxpayers to a burden without a vote. And they're going to get around the voting requirements of Prop 26 as well as the property tax protections of Prop 13.
Yeah, it's really sad. It's intergenerational debt. And it's not intergenerational debt for more water or truly a secure water supply with climate change. For our listeners who are joining us, this is Delta Flows on KXVS, the voice of Stockton. I'm Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla, and today I'm talking about the status of the Delta Tunnels project with Delta area attorneys Tom Keeling and Osha Miserve. And also joining us is Planning and Conservation League project manager for water, Jonas Mintins. Osha, if you can expand on where things stand, where we're at in all these processes at the State Water Resources Control Board. We finished the first round of hearings. Can you talk about what happens next in that process at the State Water Resources Control Board?
Sure, Barbara. I just wanted to add something that I thought was sort of dark humorous from the Westlands meeting I attended over the summer regarding intergenerational equity, which you brought up.
Right.
Is the gentleman from Goldman Sachs at the meeting actually said that it was appropriate for intergenerational equity to burden the future with the costs by spreading the costs out over a longer time period. Just for folks thinking about their kids and their grandkids, the Goldman Sachs view of spreading that debt to the future is really, I think, quite frightening.
It really is.
The opposite of what I consider.
It really is
intergenerational equity.
Intergenerational equity versus intergenerational debt. What was really striking about that conversation is that there was no acknowledgement that the debt will be spread intergenerational to all Californians, or the vast majority of Californians, but they won't all be the recipients of receiving the water. So it's really inequity. So great.
Yeah. But let's talk about the water board, like you mentioned. So we have just submitted what's called Part 2 cases in chief for the water board, and the water board process is quite complex, and it's unique too because there really a lot of the permits that this massive project needs really haven't been the subject of public hearings and a public process. Much of the planning has taken place behind closed doors. There were meetings that took place early on, starting in about 2008, that the public was able to attend, but it wasn't a formal process, and that was all about the project that was already deemed to be infeasible and abandoned, that would have tried to contribute to the recovery of endangered species, and included a lot of other things in addition to the tunnels that supposedly were going to help the Delta. So one of the key features of the water board process that I think a lot of us appreciate is that it is a public process where the public can come forward, bring forth evidence about the injury to water users that would come about if this project went forward, as well as the unreasonable impacts to fish and wildlife, and the inconsistency with important concepts like public trust that protect our public waterways, fishing, boating, and those kinds of things, and as well as the public interest. So Part one of the proceedings is complete, and that took place over 32 hearing days beginning in 2016 and went through the summer, into the summer of this year, 2017. And so a whole host of about 80 individual protestants is what they call the entities that would protest the change in water rights that Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation, who operate the state and federal water projects, have requested. In their request, they are saying that this is just a minor change, that putting these massive new diversions that would be end-to-end, a few miles long along the Sacramento River, is only a minor change from the current configuration of these projects, which draws the water out of the southern delta. So, of course, folks who are protesting this change in water rights are claiming, number one, that it's actually a new water right because it's from a new source up on the Sacramento River, which is the water that the exporters are seeking because it's so much better quality water. In addition, they're claiming that it would be better for fish, and part of what's wasn't a part one issue, but now that we're getting to part two, which is focused on fish and wildlife, public trust, and public interest, we've just submitted on the last day of November our cases in chief showing why this project would be so terrible for those considerations, the more environmental considerations. It is a quasi-judicial proceeding, so that it has witnesses presenting testimony. Those witnesses are cross-examined. They're presenting evidence to support their opinions, and a tremendous amount of efforts being put in by environmental groups, as well as the local public agencies and statewide groups that are concerned about everything from the environmental impacts and water quality impacts all the way to the public interest considerations in financial and environmental justice as well. So we're about to get started with the Part 2 hearings in January, and that's going to begin with the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau presenting their view of why this project would not have unreasonable impacts on fish and wildlife, public trust, and the public interest. They put forth a rather abbreviated presentation, I believe, and they're going to be saving their powder for what's called rebuttal, because there's been a huge outpouring of evidence and information that the protestants, which is our side of the ledger at the State Water Board, have presented. And we've been working on bringing forth experts from sort of every nook and cranny, all the way from the fish issues to the wildlife issues I mentioned earlier with terrestrial wildlife and birds, as well as the impacts on public interest in water supplies locally, and agriculture, of course, in the Delta, as well as the local issues with getting our food supplies from local areas and things that generally are very important to us here, and we think statewide and nationwide. So that's all going to be playing out at the Water Board in the coming months. They've scheduled hearing days like 3 and 4 days a week all the way through July, I think, in an attempt to try to get through the Water Board process before the end of the year when the governor's term ends. Even at the end of July, we will still have more briefing, and it may be necessary to extend out the time, but I think the Water Board is attempting to try to get through its decision by the end of the year with the schedule they've laid out, for now at least. And it's not clear with all the different evidence, and I haven't counted up what I think the number of days of testimony are. I think it's going to be at least as long as what was called Part 1 in terms of presenting all this information and showing why this project would be such a bad idea from the perspective of the public interest.
Yes, it would. And drilling down even further, OSHA, for our listeners, works with a lot of groups that would be in the bullseye of the new intakes for the tunnels project. And the impacts translate and are a little bit different here on the San Joaquin County side. Tom, you're representing the county. What are the concerns in for you at the Water Board case about what the impacts really would be for residents here in San Joaquin County?
Well, let's divide those impacts into two phases. Construction, and nobody's mentioned it, but construction is supposed to take 14 years.
Right.
If everything goes perfectly, can you imagine a project this massive going on for 14 years outside your house or on your land or near your business? And then operation, assuming this thing is ever approved, assuming it's ever built, and I doubt that it could be built in 14 years, and it starts operating. So during the construction phase, there will be a number of impacts on transportation within the Delta. Not just the North Delta. Certainly the North Delta will be the most seriously impacted, but also roads in San Joaquin County, including levee access roads. And as you know, the Delta is heavily dependent upon levees for public safety and security, as well as for agriculture and business. Highway 4, Highway 12 will see impacts, and of course further north, some fairly serious impacts on getting around in the Delta during that 14 years. And by the way, I know OSHA gave a figure about the muck. The muck are the spoils. Basically, saturated spoils are called muck. I forget the number OSHA gave, but I figured it out. It's the equivalent of 13.5 Great Pyramids of Giza plopped down in the middle of the Delta.
That's amazing.
Okay? And that's going to happen in this 14 years if they build this monstrosity. The impact to wildlife and habitat throughout the Delta, including San Joaquin County, will be serious given the day and night massive truck traffic through roads, across roads, and in areas that are not used to that. The noise, the dust, the light, they're going to have to be bringing in, they're going to have to build separate power lines to power these mammoth machines, and there'll be a number of these operating at once in the Delta. So that's construction, during construction. It will have terrible impact on businesses, by the way, that work in the Delta, as well as agricultural enterprises that are trying to get produce harvest done and harvest quickly to, for example, grapes to the vintners, to the wineries. During operation, there's just a multiplicity of serious impacts. Right at the top of the list for San Joaquin County is the very real threat of increased salinity that will adversely affect agriculture and wildlife, for that matter.
Right.
Because, as you know, the Delta depends on flows towards the bay to flush out the salinity, and it's the Delta is tidal. We have 2 high tides a day.
Right.
It brings in salt from the ocean, and then it flushes it out. Well, by having the freshest source of water diverted around the Delta instead of through the Delta, that flushing mechanism is impaired tremendously. So that's going to be a very serious impact. It will also affect water quality in general. There are other noxious constituents we don't want, including mercury, arsenic, and others that are likely to be increased fairly substantially as a result of this project. So water quality, its effect on agriculture, its effect on local water supplies, and then there are secondary effects. To the extent it affects agriculture, it affects the economy of the county and the economy of the Delta. This is a heavily agriculture-dependent and recreation-dependent, including boating and fishing. We have ecotourism and ag tourism here in the Delta and in this county that will be very adversely affected and in some cases eliminated.
That's right, which is really a problem. What a lot of people don't realize is that while this process is going on at the Water Board, there's a whole second set of processes on water quality plan updates, one for the San Joaquin River and one for the Sacramento rivers. So, Jonas, those processes are unfolding, and can you explain what's the relationship between these water quality plan updates for the rivers and flows and the tunnels? And sometimes it feels like we have the chicken before the egg on how this is all played out at the State Water Board, determining how much water we need in the Delta. Can you describe for us a bit the processes?
Sure. It's been known for decades that diversions from the Delta have continued to affect the ecosystem and the water quality already. There's a federal law that requires the state to regularly update its plan to protect the water quality of all bodies, but certainly including the Delta. So the problem here is that the process of pushing forward on these deltas violates not only the law, but also violates, frankly, just common sense. And this is how that works. Under the law, the state is supposed to every 5 years update that plan to identify how much water is needed within the body for all the beneficial uses. And Tom did an excellent job identifying the agricultural, business, ecosystem, environmental, and other uses within the Delta. Well, under pressure from those who divert from the Delta, the state has lagged behind. Now, not just lagged behind, they're more than decades behind in updating that plan. So from a common sense perspective, you'd say, well, should you first identify how much water the Delta needs for all the beneficial uses? And then you can identify how much water is available to be exported from the Delta for uses outside. Well, the water diverters, the Jerry Brown administration, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and others have forced through a flipping of that process. Instead of first seeing how much water the Delta needs and what's left, they've said, this is our project, and whatever's left will be whatever's left for those beneficial agricultural, recreational, environmental uses. And they say, well, don't worry, because in the future, under this adaptive management, we'll ensure that there are not bad impacts. Well, let's just be using common sense again here. If these water districts spend at least $17 billion, they borrow these funds for decades, are they going to be content with only diverting the same amount of water they have in the past? Hell no. No one's going to accept that as reality. They're going to press, and they've shown the ability to do it, to increase diversions to the detriment of all the folks in San Joaquin County. That's one of the reasons why hearings such as Delta legislators had last week are so important, that they, although this project has been put together in a way that does not, it's hard to believe, require any vote of the public.
That's right.
It does not require a vote of the legislature. Nonetheless, legislators can examine the project to see if it complies with other existing laws.
Exactly.
And so, again, the hearing they had and the need for additional hearings is important. We've already seen just in October when the state auditor identified flaws in the process. And this is the process that spent $280 million of water users and it appears some taxpayer funds. In August, the federal inspector general determined that the Bureau of Reclamation, that's been one of the partners in this, they provide some of the water, they divert water, they did not disclose to Congress that they spent over $80 million to pursue this project with no congressional approval. This is evidence of the kind of, frankly, just shenanigans that have gone on to date, and if the process were to proceed, I think we could all expect that to continue.
Sadly, it would escalate, especially with the, we figure, with the creation of joint power authorities, because those legal entities are so inaccessible for people and not transparent to get reports and to make complaints. It would make public oversight for good government, we think, really difficult. Jonas, a second follow-up question. I know I'm hitting a lot of different topics here, but, you know, we have current biological opinions right now for the Delta also. How does that fit into the adaptive management scenario for operation of the tunnels and then these water quality plan updates? How does that piece fit in? Because that's law. That, I mean, that has to be followed.
Well, there are things called biological opinions. They're not really opinions. They are requirements that the state and most importantly, federal fishery agencies put on. They're, in essence, permit conditions on a water project such as this. They say this is how much you can divert and when you can divert it. Now, not surprisingly, back to shenanigans, in this case, they did issue a biological opinion that the state of California says, aha, we've got that permit. But when we actually look at the permit, you see it is only a permit for the construction of the project. It is not a permit for the operation of the project. Again, why is this important? Because the operation determines how much water is diverted, when it's diverted, which of course results in impacts. And so the federal agencies that frankly had their arms more than twisted, a couple of them I think had their arms broken, to come up with this permit, this biological opinion to allow the construction, even with two broken arms, would not sign off on the permit for the operation because, frankly, every independent science review has clearly shown that the operation of the project is almost certain to lead to devastating impacts on environmental resources such as, well, delta smelt. Now, not everybody cares about delta smelt. Frankly, it's a minnow. Now, it's also an indicator species.
Right.
Okay, but it would also have huge impacts and in some cases lead to the extirpation, that means the wiping out of some of the salmon runs. Well, you might not care about delta smelt, but I sure love salmon.
Right.
And so these biologists were unwilling, even under intense pressure, and we know what that's about, to sign off on that operation. That's something that would be put off to some time in the future. That causes problems for water users within the Delta without knowing it. It also causes problems for those who would pay the at least $17 billion when they don't know how the project would be operated or allowed to be operated and how much water they would get.
That's right, and it goes back to those bond payments are a fixed amount, so it's hard to take less water to actually protect an ecosystem if you have a fixed bond payment. Mick.
And behind that is the specter of a potential stranded asset. That's a phrase you're going to hear more often as this progresses. If it turns out that the costs are more, and we think they will be greatly increased, it may not pencil for those who want the water.
That's right.
And if the regulatory structure under which this would have to operate is guided by science rather than political pressure from the top down, they may not be able to operate it in a way that makes financial sense for the people who paid for it. So we will end up with the two most expensive tunnels probably in the history of the world sitting idle in the Delta. Maybe we can run the high-speed rail through them or something.
Jonas, you want to add something to that?
Well, it's about how our society, our democracy operates. In this case, we have one branch of the government, the state government, the administration, that's Jerry Brown, and he's pushing this forward, you know, full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes. We have the judicial branch, which is fully engaged in this, and as you know, when you have 30 lawsuits, they're going to be heard from. But we also have the legislative branch.
Right.
And even though they do not have a direct control over this, they do have a role in overseeing the implementation of state laws, a whole variety of them. That's why it's so important for those legislators, including leadership that we've seen from the Delta legislators, to continue to press on this issue. They, just as we're seeing in Washington, when the legislative branch in some cases doesn't step up, it allows the administration to run kind of roughshod over our values, frankly.
That's right.
And in this case, we have to thank and continue to urge our legislators to continue their important role in our democracy.
That's right. It's financial oversight and, frankly, legal oversight of California state environmental laws. Both need to happen at the legislative level. You know, for a lot of us who work on fighting the tunnels, it can become so consuming. It's very easy to lose sight of what it is you actually want to see happen for the Delta, or what you would like to see accomplished. And so, Osha, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. You know, if you could wave a magic wand tomorrow and this was all gone, what would you actually like to see for the Delta other than simply stopping the tunnels?
Thanks for asking that question. I think it's a really important one, is that, you know, we've spent almost 10 years now fighting what we think would destroy the Delta and be bad for all of California, not just the folks right under the footprint of this project. And so we haven't had a chance to, and I think we would all like to work more on what is the vision for California going forward. How do we deal with changes in the future to our climate, and plan smart for those things so that our kids do have a bright future with respect to their water supplies and their environment both. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of great work that the state has done on planning for that future, and I think a lot of the programs that the Department of Water Resources have been working on in their California Water Action Plan, which is being updated now, which is, you know, promoting local water supplies and reuse, stormwater, doing recharge for groundwater, which we've found is quite critical, and just, I mean, I think that the change in thinking, though, that is needed is that there's not one huge thing that can be done, like a big project like the tunnels, that's going to fix everything, right? California water fix. It doesn't work that way. It's got to be a combination of a lot of little things put together that make our future work in terms of water supplies and allow us to adapt. Building huge pipes and rerouting rivers isn't the way to be adaptable to the future. And I think the state, we have those answers. A lot of people are working on them. I think those of us who've been fighting the tunnels and the trenches would love to work more on those kinds of solutions. Yes. And I think as soon as the tunnels are declared dead, which they're not yet, and we have to keep fighting until they are, we won't be able to expend our energy on those shared solutions. And I think that people are willing to make compromises in order to make sure that everyone in the state has access to clean, safe drinking water. But it can't be one area being sacrificed for another, or sacrificing our fish, or sacrificing the future for these kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of good things that can be done. And you know, one of the awful things I've heard promoting the tunnels is, oh, this is how areas in the South San Joaquin are going to reach groundwater sustainability. I mean, what is crazier than that? We have to destroy the Sacramento River and the Delta in order to recharge the groundwater that they've unfortunately overpumped and abused. You know, there's a lot better things we can do. There are smaller recharge projects that take advantage of flood flows. We don't need to pump the Delta dry in order to reach sustainability, and it won't be sustainable. And I think that's some of the interesting evidence that if members of the public want to check out what's going on at the Water Board, we're going to be talking about those big picture items. And I encourage everyone to also, I think public opinion does matter. There's not a vote on this project, but I think it matters what people are thinking and saying, not to just their legislators, but also to their friends and neighbors. And yes. I think people need to be clear they don't accept this as a solution, and this isn't our future. And I think that message will be heard by the folks who eventually should drop this project and move on to better solutions.
I completely agree with you. Public opinion does matter, regardless of whether you can vote or not. Politicos don't like to be disliked, and they don't like to face opposition for things that they allow to happen. So, Tom, this is probably an interesting question for you, because you work in the legal realm, and you know, you're representing things, and you're kind of down in the weeds about what needs to be stopped. But when you stop and think about things, if the tunnels were taken out of the picture, what would you like to see happen for the region and for the Delta and for our waterways?
Glad you asked that. Perhaps the most frustrating and maddening statement, again, it's a drumbeat, a mantra that comes out of the tunnel proponents, is that the opponents, that would be us, want to maintain the status quo in the Delta. I just scream when I hear that. It is
yes.
an absolute lie.
Yes.
I have yet to meet an opponent of the tunnels who advocates for the status quo. The delta is broken. Everybody around the table agrees with that.
That's right.
The problem with the tunnels is that they suck all the air out of the room. You know, OSHA explained very well what the suite of preferable, clearly superior options is, but they all take money. And that money right now, and that energy, and that creativity is being diverted to this monstrosity of a project to benefit a few.
Right.
So the number one, I very much agree with OSHA's view that there is a suite of alternatives. I'd like to see local development. A lot of MET's clients also agree that for the development of local water supplies, which is a problem for MET, I might add.
Right.
That's what I would like to see. Right now, the county of San Joaquin, which I represent, is fighting these tunnels before the board. I represent the county of San Joaquin, Contra Costa, Yolo, Solano, in the CEQA action with OSHA, and add Butte County and Plumas County to that group of counties in the validation action. So all of these counties, Delta and some above Delta counties, are fighting this in order to get to a more rational set of solutions that is science-based, common sense-based, and feasible.
That's wonderful. And Jonas, you know, you really get to have the final word on this question because you have been working on Delta solutions with groups, including Restore the Delta, for a number of years, and I think those efforts are kind of re-emerging. Can you talk about some of the solutions that you'd like to see, particularly in the Delta, and what can be done, and how do we go forward?
Yes, a few years ago, we brought together several groups: the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the Westlands Water District, Restore the Delta, all the 5 counties within the Delta. And in that time, in short time, 6 months, they were able to identify over 40 projects that would improve conditions in the broken delta. These were projects that would strengthen levees, that benefit farmers. It also benefits the water districts that get water from the delta. They make them more resistant to earthquake. They're environmental projects, restoration projects. These are in places where they're willing landowners who want to participate. They're projects to help improve the agricultural viability of the delta so that there's good access to water, and the roads, they're important to move the goods around. So 40 projects, people said these should all move forward.
That's right.
The problem, as Tom pointed out, is when the governor keeps pushing for the tunnels, everybody has to say, wait a minute, we only have so many resources. We've got to send Tom Keeling back into court. Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla is going to be there doing outreach to people within the Delta. And so as soon as we can get these tunnel ideas beyond us, I think we can fairly quickly start identifying and moving on those kinds of projects.
And throughout the state, can you expand a little bit too on what you see? I mean, I know OSHA named some of them, but people forget that, you know, besides urban water, there are things we should be doing in the Sierra as well that complement this.
There are a whole suite of activities. Where does our water actually come from? It comes from the mountains. And what are we doing to preserve those environments? We know that the threat of fire, for instance, as we're seeing right now in Southern California, is important there. It's also tragic when it hits our watersheds. Massive fires reduce the ability of those watersheds to hold water as sponges to be released later in the year. There are other projects that Southern California is undertaking, major water recycling projects that substitute the need for sucking water from the Delta. So that's what progressive agencies are doing. They create local jobs in their communities. They're much more cost effective. They're less impacting on greenhouse gases because you're not trying to pump water hundreds of miles. So there are lots of things going on that get overshadowed by the headlines of this silly project.
It's really true. I can't thank you enough Tom, and Jonas for joining us today, and Osha for joining us on the phone. We want to thank our listeners for participating and listening with the show and following our work. We also want to thank Governor Don here at KXVS, Voice of Stockton. I want to remind everyone that it is the season for giving. If you enjoy listening to Delta Flows and the information you get here and all the great programming that the Voice of Stockton is broadcasting, go to their website, go to their Facebook page, please make a donation. If 10,000 people in Stockton donated $10 a year, this station could have the chance to expand its solid local programming even further. We look forward to next week's show. Joining us, we will have members from the Locke Historical Society, and we'll be discussing the role of Chinese immigration in shaping and building the Delta. Thank you so much. We look forward to participating and talking more about the Delta again next week.
Thank you, Barbara.